I was pleasantly surprised by James McBride's book, The Good Lord Bird. I've seen a lot of discussion online about this book and its portrayal of John Brown, but I think most of these discussions online miss the main point that McBride is making in his novel. There are a number of themes that appear throughout the book, but the principal of these is identity. And while John Brown isn't the central character, and his identity isn't pondered in a main narrative sense like The Onion's is, the entirety of The Good Lord Bird presents a meta-narrative that actually is about John Brown and who he is. And while he is presented in a charactered form, I don't think McBride is presenting it in a mean-spirited way. In fact, I think the way Brown is portrayed in the book reveals who he was in a deeper, more real, true sense. And that's a common criticism I see leveled against the book, is its portrayal of John Brown as a crazed madman, which some people may see as appropriate, but is a perspective I don't believe is historically accurate. But I don't think it really matters. Even if the events depicted in the book aren't historically accurate, the book isn't about history, it's about historiography. That being the way history is told and the way the people and events in history are thought and talked about. John Brown is one of the most divisive figures in American history. You either see him as a hero, terrorist, madman, or a man with conviction. What you say about the man and what he did might say more about you than it does about him.
Illuminate the shadow, break oppression with your mighty arm. Oh God, our help in the time of trouble. Oh God, our help in the time of trouble. Oh God, our help in the time of trouble.
I'm standing in the middle of the Black Jack battlefield, what is sometimes called the first battle of the American Civil War. To my left is where Captain John Brown and his abolitionist forces stood and fought, and to my right is where Henry C. Pate and his pro-slavery forces stood and fought. The position we're standing in right now is where the pro-slaver Henry Clay Pate and his militia of pro-slavers would have stood looking down on the battlefield, commanding a fairly commanding position. Now, what's interesting to note is that Bleeding Kansas kind of became a noted case of swallowing the spider to get the fly. And Henry Clay Pate was one of the leading members of the raid on Lawrence. Now, in response to the raid on Lawrence, John Brown committed the Potawatomi Massacre. Now, in response to the Potawatomi Massacre, Pate and his men set out to find John Brown, leading them here. Now, him and his men were out searching for John Brown, but John Brown and his men were out searching for Pate. If you look back there, that thicket of trees, that little dark area, is where John Brown and his militia of men were waiting for Pate to draw them out. What's really interesting about this battle is that Brown and Pate weren't actually too far away from each other the night before. Brown arrived about 10 p.m. last night and camped out around that thicket of trees over there. However, as morning broke and it became clear that they were actually way closer than they thought they were, Brown and Pate's forces began approaching each other and about a distance of 200 to 300 yards, dismounted and began firing each other. In about the first half hour of the battle, Pate and Brown were locked in combat in this area, generally speaking. The conflict would have taken place right over this bridge in this kind of creek area. After a period of sustained withering fire, Pate and his men decided it was time to throw in the towel. You see, John Brown was using the newly manufactured Sharps rifle that he had collected through his time traveling through the country and coming down to Kansas to join his sons in the fight against slavery in Kansas. On this side is where John Brown and his men would have been, and then if you look over here, this is where Pate and his men would have been, with the battle occurring somewhere in between these two trees, is where most of the crossfire would have occurred. Now, the initial offer of surrender given by Pate was a conditional surrender, that being that Pate and his men would get to keep their weapons and they would be taken as prisoner. John Brown responded by pointing a pistol at him and saying no such terms would be accepted. After the initial terms of surrender were rejected by John Brown, Pate and his men tried to flee on horseback. However, they had discovered that their horses and mules had been killed by John Brown's forces, as well as his son, Frederick Brown. Now, if you look back this way, that area back there, if you can see through the bramble and brushes, this place should probably be better maintained than it is. But if you can see through all the brambles and brushes, that area is where the horses and mules would have been put down by Frederick and some of John Brown's men. Now, this battle is significant for a number of reasons. It is the first militia versus militia action we see in the American Civil War. Secondly, 2 of John Brown's sons had been previously kidnapped by pro-slavery militias, and by capturing Pate in this battle, he was able to meet up with Jeb Stuart and exchange Pate for his 2 sons. The next time that John Brown would see Jeb Stuart would be under the command of Robert E. Lee at the siege of Harper's Ferry. Another interesting note about the Battle of Blackjack and Harper's Ferry is that the Bowie knife that Brown captured from Pate would later be used to model the pikes given to free enslaved peoples during the Battle of Harper's Ferry. Now, a counter to the thesis I presented at the very beginning of this video is the fact that it is historical fiction, not just fiction. And standing in a place like this, hearing the floorboards creak and seeing the place where John Brown would have laid up when he was sick, writing to his sons, kind of makes you appreciate that a little bit more. And I do think there is something to be said for that claim. After all, these were real people, really suffering, fighting against a real evil. Now, I think my thesis still stands up because the book itself, again, is not about history, it's about historiography. But having a proper understanding of the history, especially when it's so close to us, helps us develop a deeper and more rich understanding of the story that McBride is telling. The anachronisms inside of The Good Lord Bird don't change the argument that McBride is making, because the argument that he's making is about how John Brown is perceived. And just as how it's inaccurate to say, it's anachronistic to say that John Brown was a crazed terrorist running around Kansas with a thirst for blood. Now, the point of this video, the thesis itself, set out to determine whether or not it did or it didn't matter that the book was playing with some historical details here or there, to determine if the historical inaccuracies or the historical anachronisms inside The Good Lord Bird lessened its value as a commentary on John Brown. And I think in a sense, it does and it doesn't. In one sense, it does, because these were real people really experiencing real violence in the 1850s in Kansas and Missouri. But in another sense, what McBride is trying to do is not necessarily tell a 100% accurate biography of John Brown's life. Instead, he's commenting on how we view John Brown. And because of that, it's okay to play with the details. The perception of John Brown as a madman is playing with the details of history. It comes from Lost Cause revisionism. It comes from Woodrow Wilson. And in a sense, that's the common perception today of John Brown. He's a crazed madman. Because what he's doing is not writing a biography, but rather a character study of John Brown. While there is legitimate criticism for making light of events like the Potawatomi Massacre, McBride is able to make light of these things because he's trying to point out the absurdity of the entire situation. The idea that a human can own another human is inherently absurd. The idea of a long-bearded, Bible-thumping madman running across Kansas, freeing the slaves on a holy mission from God, is absurd. And so when McBride is able to point out these little details, and as he says himself, make a caricature of these things, we're able to relate with these stories on a deeper level. And so while going to all these sites and learning the real historical details helps us relate with the actual events and sympathize with those people whose blood was spilled, so too does caricaturing these individuals and understanding how their character has been perceived throughout history and the absurdity of the situation they were in. The narrative that McBride presents is, in essence, true enough. The nuances, the details, the little flummoxes and the absurdities help us relate with John Brown on a level that we might not get from just reading a biography straight through. Now, I could be totally wrong about all of this, and the one side that says you can't make light of any of these historical events could be totally true, or the other side that says, well, truth doesn't really matter, could also be entirely true, ironically. But either way, the book, The Good Lord Bird, is worth reading. Because what McBride does is, in a way, more advanced than simply reading through a historical biography. His depiction of John Brown serves to parallel how we viewed him throughout history. And because of that, it not only serves as a fact-by-fact, day-by-day analysis of his life, but it also serves as a commentary on how we look back on history and where we are currently.